Hi friends, I appreciate you joining me today for this Bible study. This is the Sunday School or Bible study lesson that's slated for July the 19th, year 2020. And we're using the Explore the Bible curriculum, and the title for today's lesson is Living Wisely. Living Wisely. We're in Proverbs chapter 14, verses 8 through 15. So get your Bible, open it to Proverbs 14. I think it's a travesty if we ever have a Bible study class or a Bible study lesson and we don't actually get a Bible in our hands and open our Bible and read the Bible. Now, when I prepare my notes, I have a Bible study program that actually helps me print the Bible study, the Bible words or the text onto a piece of paper. So I'm looking at the Bible, I'm looking at my notes as well. But we need to get in the Bible and stay in God's Word always. Thanks for joining me today. I appreciate it. And of course, Solomon is writing pithy sayings for his son about God's wisdom and how we need God's wisdom. And I'm telling you, we desperately need God's wisdom in these days. So spend some time in prayer, seeking the heart of God. Spend time in His Word, listening to God speak to you, to give you the wisdom that you need to know how to respond in these days of testing. The subtitle for today's lesson is Following God's Wisdom Leads to Joy, while failing to do so leads to grief. So the primary thrust is that if we follow God's wisdom and if we listen to God's advice and we do what God tells us, it will lead to the wonderful life, the abundant life that Jesus promised us all. But if we do not, if we choose our way, then it leads to suffering, it leads to difficulty, it leads to grief as we try to live our lives apart from God. I was reading an illustration that helped me understand that a little bit. A pilot was flying his plane one day, and he flew the plane into a cloud bank, which he thought was relatively small. He thought he'd fly into the cloud bank and he'd be out of it on the other side in just a few moments. Well, it turned out to be much larger than he anticipated. And so he thought, well, I'll just pull the nose of the plane up and I'll just fly above the cloud bank. Well, he did that for a little while, but he still didn't come out of the clouds. And so he said, well, I'll just point the nose of the plane down. So he did that and descended for a while, but he just still couldn't get out of the cloud bank. And so after a little while, he became disoriented, and he began to think that he was flying upside down. He began to feel like he was literally upside down in the plane, or with the plane. And so after a while, he just starts getting nervous. He said, sweat's pouring down my face. And I look down at my instruments, and my instruments tell me that I'm flying right side up. But everything in me tells me that I'm flying upside down. And he said it was at that moment I had to make a decision. Was I going to trust the instruments of the plane, or was I going to trust my feelings? He said I decided I would trust the instruments that were telling me that I was flying right side up. And he said I began to descend according to the instruments, and after a while I was able to exit the cloud bank. And he said, when I did, I came out fairly close to the ground. He said, if I had not followed the instruments, I would have died. The plane would have crashed. But because I trusted the instruments, they saved my life. Now, God's wisdom is like that. God's wisdom comes to us, and sometimes God says, this is the way, walk this way. But our feelings tell us different. The circumstances look so different. The culture tells us different. Don't listen to what God says, go this way. But if we'll learn to lean into God's wisdom, as Solomon is giving his son, we'll find the life that God has designed for us. Now let me read the passage. It's Proverbs 14, 8 through 15. And then we're going to come back and kind of break it down into sections or couplets so that we can understand what he's saying. Proverbs 14, 8. The wisdom of the sensible is to understand his way, but the foolishness of fools is deceit. Fools mock at sin, but among the upright there is goodwill. The heart knows its own bitterness, and a stranger does not share its joy. The house of the wicked will be destroyed, but the tent of the upright will flourish. There is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. Even in laughter the heart may be in pain, but the end of joy may be grief. The backslider in heart will have his fill of his own ways, but a good man will be satisfied with his. The naive believes everything, but the sensible man considers his steps. All right, so let's look at the passage and try to break it apart into bits and pieces, bite-sized pieces. Solomon is using a poetic style in this passage where the main point doesn't come at the beginning, it doesn't come at the end, but it comes right in the middle. And the verses on either side, the beginning and the end, actually lend to support the main thrust of the passage, which is in the middle. So the main message is found in verses 11, 12. In verses 11 and 12, what he's telling us here is that there are basically two ways to live. There is man's way, which leads to destruction, unhappiness, ruin, and there is God's way, the way of wisdom, which leads to joy and purpose and meaning in life. And so we get to choose which way we live. And Solomon is contrasting the two ways. And of course, he's encouraging his son to choose the way of wisdom, not the way of ruin. So what is wisdom? Well, there's a lot of different definitions for wisdom. I found this definition, which I love. It's an old Irish toast, which simply says, "May you have the hindsight to know where you've been, the foresight to know where you're going, and the insight to know when you've gone too far." Isn't that good? Let me read that again. May you have the hindsight to know where you've been, the foresight to know where you're going, and the insight to know when you've gone too far. So God is telling us that we need wisdom. And the wisdom that we need only comes from God. The wisdom that we need for life will not come through age. It will not come through experience. It will not even come through advanced training. It's great that we can have all of those things, but the wisdom that we need can come only from God. So let's look at the couplets. And what Solomon does in this passage, we'll see he takes a verse from the beginning and he takes a verse from the end, and he joins that together to support the main thrust that's in the middle, verses 11 and 12. So the first couplet is verse 8 and verse 15. Verse 8 and verse 15. In verse 8, he said, "The wisdom of the sensible is to understand his way, but the foolishness of fools is deceit." Prudence involves thinking through a situation, making sure that you have the facts and know the different options before you draw a conclusion and make a decision. Just to be prudent, to be wise about something. A foolish person doesn't do that. A foolish person doesn't take time to gather all the facts. They think about what they feel, and then they act, or rather we might say they react to the circumstances. I hate to say it, but I think a lot of the riots that we saw in our country in the last few weeks were basically reactions to a situation that a lot of people really didn't understand. Not to devalue anyone's life. All lives matter. But a wise person stops and thinks before they act. You don't just join in with a group of other people because it seems the thing to do in the moment. So he says, a wise person makes good decisions based on God's insight into a circumstance. And those without God's wisdom are sure to choose the wrong path every time. Now, are you open to God's wisdom? Is your heart open to listen to what God has to say, to spend time in prayer, to spend time in His Word, trying to gather what God's way of doing things really is and then acting on that? Or do you have your mind already made up? I read about a guy that was out on a golf course, and this particular club had a golf pro, that would come and give lessons. And the golf pro came out one day, and he had a young man with him who was paying for him to teach him how to play golf. And so the third party was just observing the circumstance. And he said the golf pro watched the young man take a swing, and then he gave him some words of advice about how to improve his swing. And the young man, rather than listening to the advice, decided, oh, no, I know what I did wrong. And so he corrected the golf professional about how he should improve his own swing. Well, they went on to the next tee, and he tried again, and the golf professional gave him some advice about how to improve. And the young man again chafed at that and said, no, I think this is what I need to do. Well, the whole day went like that. And at the end of the day, the young man paid his fee, and then he walked off the course. And the third-party observer was turned to the golf pro, and he said, I can't believe that you would allow that young man to continue to think that he was doing right when you know a better way to play golf. This is what the golf pro said in response. He said, I learned a long time ago that it's a waste of time to sell answers to a man who only wants to buy echoes. Some of us really don't want to hear the truth. We just want somebody to applaud our opinion and approve of what we're already doing or deciding to do. God's wisdom will help us know how to live if we'll just be sensible and listen to what His wisdom says. So verse 8 is connected with verse 15. Verse 15 says, the naive believes everything, but the sensible man considers his steps. A naive person, another way of translating that, is a person who is inexperienced. This is a person who believes what they feel and see. They're living according to their senses. Another word that might be used to help you understand it is a gullible person, a person who doesn't have sound wisdom in making decisions. They're just easy to convince. They kind of, James talks about a person who is tossed back and forth by waves on the sea because they believe one thing one day and they believe another thing the next day, and they just don't have any real stability about themselves. I read about a person kind of like that in Brazil, a farmer who had some salesmen come to his farm and sold him a money-making machine. According to the story, there were 4 slick salesmen who came and had a machine, a contraption that they had devised and actually had real currency in it, and convinced this farmer that this machine could make money. Man, I'd love to find a machine like that, wouldn't you? A machine that produces money. And so he bought it. He used all of his life savings and purchased this machine, only to learn soon afterward that it was a hoax, that he'd wasted his money. Rather than realizing the mistake that he had made, he takes the machine to the local police department and asks them to fix the machine so that it will work. Now that is truly a gullible person. Solomon says to his son, please don't be this way. Jesus in Matthew chapter 10 says, behold, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. So be shrewd as serpents and innocent as doves. So God tells us that our heart needs to be pure, but at the same time we need to be wise in how we deal with others. A sensible or a wise person is one who considers the direction of his life and lives in a way that pleases God. With every decision that we make, the decisions may be small and seemingly insignificant, but we need to make sure that those are blessed by God, that we get His insight in His direction. So the first couplet is verse 8 and verse 15. Then we move to the second couplet, verse 9 and verse 14. Remember, the verses on either side are sandwiched toward the truth that's in the middle of verses 11 and 12. Verse 9 says, fools mock at sin, but among the upright there is good will. It is a foolish person who makes light of a godly lifestyle and says, oh, that really doesn't matter, and the responsibility that you assume with that godly lifestyle is really nothing. You're really a foolish person for choosing to live that way. The sin that he's referring here to, the fool mocks at sin, is also translated reparation or restitution. When a person takes on the responsibility that they have wronged someone and they know that they need to make that wrong right as much as possible, a foolish person standing outside looking at that says, oh, why would you do that? You can get away with that. Don't worry about trying to take responsibility for that. Well, the Jewish people knew very well these circumstances because the Old Testament law spoke to the need for reparation or restitution. If you have wronged someone, the law would require you to make that right with that person. Just like when Jesus is passing through the city of Jericho and he sees Zacchaeus up a sycamore tree and he is converted. He becomes a believer in Jesus, and Zacchaeus says, Lord, I'm going to sell all of my half of my possessions and give them to the poor, and I'll restore to a person 4 times if I've stolen anything wrong to them. So the Jewish people knew very well they needed to make restitution. The law also required a person to go to the temple and present a sacrifice asking forgiveness for God. So you had to not only try to make it right with the person you'd wronged, you had to make it right with God as much as possible. Solomon says a godly person, a wise person, will do this, that they will have goodwill. He says, with the upright there is goodwill. That means that you want to have the right relationship with others that you should have. But a foolish person just kind of scoffs at that and laughs off. To a foolish person, people are dispensable. There are things to be used so that we can gain more happiness for ourselves. That is an unwise way to live. Someone said, you want to know the best way to have the last word in an argument? That is to apologize. Apologizing is one of the hardest things to do, to admit that you are wrong in some way and you need to be forgiven by another person. But the Bible tells us here in verse 9 that that is the wise way to live. Verse 15, which is coupled with that, says, the backslider in heart will have his fill of his own ways, but a good man will be satisfied with his. The backslider is also translated a disloyal one. This is a person who once lived according to God's wise ways, but now for some reason has chosen to walk away from those wise ways. The writer tells us that God will hold that person accountable. God will hold us accountable for the poor choices that we make. And that's what he means by when he says, have his fill of his own ways. That God will hold us accountable for those. And we know that's true. We know that when we make stupid choices, we know that those things, we're going to have to pay for those eventually. But we know when we make good choices, wise choices, that there's blessing in that. Not only from the results of those good choices, but also from God who smiles on that. And he's teaching us here that God is going to hold us accountable for those wise choices. Scripture does not teach that God is going to allow us into heaven because we're a good person and that's all he requires of us. No, that's not true at all. We know that that's only possible through faith in Jesus Christ. But we do know that blessings and rewards are there for those of us who will choose the way of wisdom. Corrie ten Boom said it this way, although the threads of my life have often seemed knotted, I know by faith that on the other side of the embroidery there is a crown. So all kinds of things happen to us and we make all kinds of choices in this life. And we may not understand why we must choose the best, God's way, the best way. But we know that God's working all those together and that it is a wonderful tapestry on the other side that we'll see someday. So here's the third couplet, verse 10 and verse 13. Verse 10 says, the heart knows its own bitterness, and a stranger does not share its joy. He's saying again that the unwise person makes choices that lead to heartache and lead to bitterness in life. There's no real joy can be found in a person's lifestyle that continues to make choices that do not honor God. Walter Hendrickson once said, we cannot control everything that happens to us, but we can control how we respond to those things that happen to us. He said, as one old saint once said, I will never allow another person to ruin my life by making him hate me. We get to choose how we respond to the circumstances of life. So Solomon's saying, choose God's way, choose the godly way, choose the way of wisdom, don't choose the way of the world. Hebrews 12:15 says, see to it that no one comes short of the grace of God, and that no root of bitterness springing up causes trouble, and by it many have been defiled. Don't choose the way that leads to bitterness. The writer of Hebrews says even many believers have chosen that way. Maybe it's because you refuse to forgive someone else. Who knows what that is? But something bad has lodged in your heart and in your mind. And rather than releasing that through the mercy and the grace of God, you hold on to that and it turns you toward bitterness. Verse 13, the writer of Proverbs says, even in laughter the heart may be in pain, and the end of joy may be grief. The wise person knows that even a person who chooses to walk away from God can have moments of happiness, moments of pleasure, but not real joy, not the fullness of life that God can provide when we choose to walk in His way. So here's the last couplet, verses 11, 12, again, which is the main thrust of the passage. The house of the wicked will be destroyed, but the tent of the upright will flourish. The life of a wise person who follows God's way is like a wise architect who builds a house on a solid foundation, knowing that storms are going to come, but that house can withstand those storms because it has the right foundation. Jesus talked about that in Matthew 7:24. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them may be compared to a wise man who built his house on the rock, and the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and slammed against that house, and yet it did not fall, for it had been founded on the rock. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and slammed against that house, and it fell, and great was its fall. The wise and the righteous person, this writer says, even if he lives in a tent, knows that's better because he's blessed by God than a person who lives unwisely, unrighteously, and lives in a palatial mansion somewhere. Verse 12, there is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. The writer says most people use their own best judgment and insight to make decisions, and they think that they've made the right choice. But in the end, they've made the wrong choice if they haven't leaned into the wisdom of God. Listen to this verse as I close today from Deuteronomy chapter 30 and verse 19. I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, the blessing and the curse. So choose life in order that you may live, you and your descendants. Moses was saying to the people as they prepared to go into the promised land, choose the way of God. Choose the way of life that God can bless you and your families who will come after you. Thank you for joining me today. I look forward to seeing you again soon.